Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the 2021 Agribusiness Management Program Virtual Summer Seminar. I'd like to introduce David Wessel, Illinois Soybean Association At-Large Director, to give us a quick welcome.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the 2021 AMP Virtual Summer Seminar. We're excited that you could join us once again for our 2-day event this summer. My name is David Wessel. I am an at-large director for the Illinois Soybean Association, and I also serve as chairman of the ISA Utilization Committee. I farm and reside near Chandlerville, Illinois with my wife, Tama, and we have 2 children. We raise corn, soybeans, wheat, cattle, and hay on our 100% no-till farm. It's my pleasure to share a few words on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association today. If you missed out on day 1 of AMP Summer Seminar, don't worry. We have incredible expert insights to cover this morning as well, and all presentations are being recorded and can be found on ilsoyadvisor.com following the event. Our hope is that soybean farmers and agribusiness professionals can use AMP as a go-to resource for advice and guidance. Through AMP, we hope that farmers and farm families find peace of mind for their decision-making, endurance in running their operations, and legacy in the ability to see their farming operations through to the next generation. We believe that farmers are leaders for both their family farm operation and the agricultural industry. And the AMP webinars deliver information that's needed for today, for this season, and for farming operations for years to come. And that is check-off money well spent. Once again, I thank you for tuning in to the AMP Summer Seminar. For more information on AMP program offerings, be sure to check us out at ilsoyadvisor.com. I thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, David. This year's AMP seminar is brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program in partnership with Illinois Farm Business Farm Management and the University of Illinois Farm Doc team. We would like to take a moment to recognize and thank our AMP partners and program sponsors, Illinois Farm Bureau, Country Financial, and the Farm Financial Standards Council for making this event possible. The sponsor of today's session is Illinois Farm Bureau, and they have prepared a short video sharing a few words with us.
Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to join the second session of the Agribusiness Management Program Virtual Summer Seminar. My name is Jenny Webb, and I serve as Illinois Farm Bureau's Member Engagement Manager. I hope to see several familiar faces out there today, and I applaud you all for taking the initiative to spend a summer day inside gaining knowledge to help you better manage your farm. Illinois Farm Bureau is a grassroots organization representing 3 out of 4 Illinois farmers, and our mission is to improve the economic well-being of agriculture and enrich the quality of farm family life. We bring value to our members through our work in the political and regulatory arenas and by providing news and information, leadership development, and advocacy for the industry that we all love. In my role, I have the opportunity to work with our Young Leader program, which is designed for 18 to 35-year-old members. The members that I work with are the future of our organization and of the whole agriculture industry. When we ask our Young Leaders and Farm Bureau members what they need from our organization, one of the responses we often get is resources, particularly in managing their farms and businesses. You all wear a lot of hats, and you can't be expected to know everything. As we started looking at developing educational resources to help our farmer members, supporting the Agribusiness Management Program seemed like a natural fit, and we're proud to partner with the Illinois Soybean Association to offer you a variety of resources over the next year. The sessions today are designed to help you navigate critical business decisions like landowner-tenant relationships and help you create a secure future for your farm, eventually passing on your legacy to the next generation. If you're an Illinois Farm Bureau member, thank you for being part of our organization. And if you're not, I would encourage you to reach out to your local county farm bureau to find out how you can get involved. I hope to see many of you at the Farm Progress Show, August 31st through September 2nd. If you're there, stop by the Illinois Farm Bureau tent for a visit with our staff and leadership and to cool off with some free ice cream. Thank you for your time and enjoy the sessions today.
Thank you again to Illinois Farm Bureau and all of AMP's program sponsors for making the 2021 AMP Summer Seminar possible. Before I introduce today's first speaker, I have just a couple of housekeeping items to mention. All of the sessions during the seminar will be recorded and can be accessed on ilsoyadvisor.com. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window and the speaker will answer those at the end. I'd also like to mention that there will be one CEU in professional development available for certified crop advisors attending each session this morning. At the end of each session, there will be a QR code for you to scan if you did not enter your CCA number during registration. We appreciate the opportunity to partner with CCAs to offer this additional benefit. I'm happy to introduce Mykel Taylor, Associate Professor at Auburn University, presenting Managing Landowner-Tenant Relationships in Today's Ag Industry. Dr. Mykel Taylor is the Alfa Endowed Eminent Scholar and Associate Professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology at Auburn University. Prior to this appointment, she held faculty positions at Kansas State University and Washington State University as an extension economist. Her current role as Alfa Endowed Eminent Scholar is to provide leadership in research and teaching in the areas of land markets and farm management. Dr. Taylor works in partnership with stakeholders from state, national, and international organizations, engaging with agricultural producers, industry, and nonprofits formulating food and agricultural policies. This workshop will focus on the challenges and opportunities of working with your landowner to successfully operate your farm business. Landowners as a group are changing, with many being generationally and geographically removed from firsthand farming experiences. The key to working with them is open and frequent communication. We will discuss who these landowners are and strategies for managing one of the most important business relationships in farming. Take it away, Mykel.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate it. I'm just going to adjust my screen here real quick and then get started. So good morning, everybody. It's nice to speak with you this morning. The advantages to doing a virtual webinar are that we can kind of tap in from lots of different places. So as Emily mentioned, I'm actually at Auburn University now. I've been down here for about 7 months, so showed up just in time to learn what it's like to get really hot in the South. But I'm very happy to join you today and happy to share with you some of the information that I've gathered over several years of working in extension, working with producers in a variety of different states, and just talking to you a little bit about what I would guess is one of the most common questions that extension folks receive, which is pertaining to leasing and questions about how to manage that leasing relationship, how to best set up contracts, how to understand what their landowner is needing, and then also getting those questions on the flip side from the landowners about their tenants. I didn't put it in the slide today, but I'll just tell you that I was digging around in some historical documents here about a year ago and found a really interesting article about how much landowners had changed and how they were becoming geographically removed from the farm. And if anybody wants to guess as to what year that document was dated, it was not in the 2000s, it was 1910. So we've been struggling or with the challenges of the landowner-tenant relationship for an awfully long time. But we're going to talk about some of the issues facing us today. So let's see if I can, yeah, okay. So what I want to talk about are leasing arrangements, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what I mean by different types of contracts. And so the leasing arrangements that we have that are more traditional are crop share, where we share income and some expenses. A net share lease where we share the income but not the expenses, and a fixed cash rent. And those are the ones that we see most often. Hybrid leases would be flex leases where we have a base fixed cash rent and we flex on price, yield, or revenue, or a fixed cash rent with some kind of formal bonus structure. So those are some of the different types of leasing arrangements. Crop share leases used to be very common. They're becoming a little less common, but in my experience, there's still quite a few people that use crop share leases. They are attractive in that the farmer and the landowner share the risk. They share production risk and commodity price risk and input price risk. And they tend to help with management decisions in that you have to be talking a lot. So you know what kind of inputs are going into the crop. You know how the crop is evolving. And technology adoption such as no-till might change that arrangement a little bit. Fixed cash leases are probably the most straightforward lease that we have, where the farmer takes on the majority of risk. Payments are made regardless of production price or cost outcomes. And management decisions can be a little more on the farmer and a little less on the landowner. It doesn't have to be that way, but we sometimes find that communication levels are lower with fixed cash leases. The joke is that end of the year, I write the check, I put it in the Christmas card, I drop it in the mail, and that's the extent of the communication that we have under a fixed cash lease arrangement. And finally, flex leases, again, where we have a fixed cash component and we flex on sources of risk like production, market prices, and revenue. I like flex leases in that they combine good features of the other types of leases of the fixed cash and the crop share. What tends to be the problem with flex leases is that they can get complex depending on how you set them up. And sometimes it's a little bit intimidating to landowners to just get them set up initially and then keep track of the information that's used to calculate what that flex is going to actually look like. So when we look at the types of leases that are used across the country, I've pulled out the Great Plains, which is in purple, and the Midwest, which are the pink states. And you can kind of see that cash leases dominate, share leases are less, and then flex leases are a pretty small percentage of the overall composition of leases across the country. And these numbers don't differentiate too much as you go around to different regions, but I just wanted to share that with you. This is kind of an interesting graph. Just kind of pay attention to the lines and how they're upward trending. And what we did here was we've been at K-State, they've been taking surveys from 2002 all the way through 2020 at different intervals and kind of finding out who's using what for leases. And so this gives us, whereas the previous slide gave us a snapshot in time in 2014, this one shows us the trends in the use of cash leases over time. And you can see it's increasing. And what we expect is going on are a couple of things that are probably driving that trend. But you'll notice Western Kansas actually has the lowest use of cash leases and Eastern Kansas has the highest use of cash leases. And some differences between Western Kansas and Eastern Kansas are size of operation and weather. And so when we look at the choice of leasing arrangement, oftentimes that risk aversion is something that is really important. Now, crop insurance has reduced some level of producer risk, but there's also, when you're in Western Kansas and we don't get as much rain and there's a lot more variability in production risk, oftentimes the crop share lease is attractive to those tenants and landowners. But we also have situations where landowners want a guaranteed income. And what I've found in some subsequent research is that, especially as landowners get older, and we'll see where the average age of landowners is quite high, but the older that they get, the more that they are interested in having that guaranteed income and not necessarily wanting to share on a crop share and be exposed to that price and production risk. And then transaction costs. So it's easy to understand a fixed cash lease. It's easy to understand what goes into it and that I'm going to get a check maybe twice a year, one at the beginning of the season, one at the end of the season, and it's going to be for X amount. And that makes sense. And so for landowners that are becoming generationally and geographically removed from farming and maybe don't understand all the nuances of farming, we see that they might prefer that fixed cash lease as well. And then one aspect that we've noticed is managing multiple leases or landowners. And so I'll go back to my example of the chart with the highest use of cash leases being in eastern Kansas, where we have the smallest farms. Well, I was talking to a producer in Miami County, which is just south of the Kansas City metro area. And he was a pretty large producer, but in order to be a large producer, he had acquired a lot of small farms. And so he actually managed just over 90 leases. Which is a lot. And the trick for him was that crop share just wasn't feasible with that many landowners. And so he used a fixed cash lease for everybody. And for communication purposes, he put together a newsletter. And so people got their check along with a newsletter to describe what was going on the farm, and that was how he communicated with it. But managing that many leases, as we grow in size, we are going to take on more leases, and so you may just have a few, and it may seem manageable now, but you can see where I'll show you where some of our farms have gotten to where they're managing 12 to 15 leases, and it gets cumbersome after a while. So let's talk about leasing relationships. And this may seem like an interesting topic for an economist, but like I said, we get a lot of questions about leasing. And what we understand is that this is a very important business relationship that you have on your farm. And in fact, for many farms, leased land represents, on average, about half of the land that we farm. And when that's the case, making sure that that land is in a good, solid relationship so that you know that you're going to get it back next year is very important. So some demographic information. Let's think about who we're talking about when we talk about landowner relationships, and that will give us some insights into who they are and what they do. So it's probably not surprising that men are the dominant gender of the producer group. So you can see I've got about 98%. This is a survey that we did of Kansas Farm Management Association producers here a couple years back, where we asked them some questions about their operation and also about their landowners. And so these are the summary statistics that I'm going to present to you today. So you can see that most of our producers are male, but women make up a much larger percentage of the landlord group. And in fact, females make up about 40% of the landowners. And then on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see here from USDA NASS from 2014, in the Great Plains, they make up about 43% of the landowners, and in the Midwest, about 35%. So does this matter for relationships? If we were in person, I would go around the room and ask you to tell me if you thought that negotiating with a woman was different than negotiating with a man. And some of you would chuckle a little bit, but you would ultimately say, yes, it's different. And I would agree. Those conversations that we have about negotiations can be different. And in fact, I've given talks at several women in ag meetings. And one of the things I've discovered is that women sometimes say things like, well, what frustrates me is that my tenant only talks to my husband. And I actually own the farm. I inherited it from my parents and it's mine, but my tenant only talks to my husband, and that really irritates me. And it was kind of interesting. I was in north central Kansas several years back, and we got on this topic, and there was a lady in the room who shared this story about how her tenant only talked to her husband, and it was frustrating. And I asked her, I said, how would you feel if your young tenant drove up to the house one day and said, how would you like to take a ride? And then drove you around the farm and showed you some of the things that he was thinking about doing with the farm and some of the ideas that he had for farming it and for the future, and just talked to you and just drove you around and didn't invite your husband. And she got this look of complete surprise on her, and she said, that would be great. She said, and I said, what would you do with regard to this with this tenant? And she said, well, I'd bake him cookies. And I thought that was kind of a funny response, but what she was saying was, I would work on that relationship. I would try to keep him. And I said, would you keep him as a tenant? And she said, definitely. And so I talk a lot to young producer groups, and I just try to remind them that you're very busy and you have a lot of things going on, but your landlord relationship is something that if you can give it some time and some effort, you can establish relationships that can last for a very long period of time. So average producer age is 59, just over 59 years old. We can see producers a lot of them are in their 60s. So this shows you a histogram of producers, and we have a much smaller group that's in the less than 40, and most of our producers are older. But what does that tell us also about how many years you've been farming? Well, so a lot of them have been farming for 40 to 50 years. Technology is allowing farmers to keep working longer, and succession plans may have been impacted by recent economic downturns. So our farmer population at an average age of just shy of 60 years old is getting up there. But here's the thing you have to remember about landowners is landowners have an average age of 73 years old. They're almost 13 years older than the typical farmer. So in many cases, you are looking at, as if you are the tenant, you are looking at working with a landowner that is older than you. And that's going to have some effects on the dynamic of the relationship. So why are landowners older? Well, we typically don't have capital to invest in farmland until much later in life, or we inherit land from our parents, and so we're older when that happens. And the implications of their age are that their communication strategies might be quite a bit different, right? I have landowners who they have phones, but they don't use them like a 30-year-old uses a phone. When I ask a 30-year-old, how do you use your phone? They sort of hold it up and say, well, I text with it, or I use social media. But my 70-year-old landowners don't necessarily use their phones the same way. They like to use it like a phone, where they call somebody. And that's kind of different. So are you willing to pick up the phone and actually call, or maybe send a letter? Again, looking at differences in communication strategies. So where do landowners live, and why does it matter? Well, about a quarter of them live on the farm, so they're probably retired farmers or spouses of retired farmers. About a quarter of them live in the same county. So live pretty close, which means that you are probably seeing them on a regular basis. And so communication is going to be different with them than the other half of our landowners who live outside the county in the same state, or outside of I'm missing my light blue should be outside of the state. So a quarter of them live outside of the state. And that's a pretty big group that don't come to the farm on a regular basis, and you're going to have to work with them on communication. And landowners love to know what's going on their farm, and that's something that we have to think about, is how many times have I sent you just an update of what's going on the farm. And by updates, I mean, it can be as simple as just taking some pictures of growing crops or baby calves, or doing some things like that. It can also be inviting them out to come see what's going on the farm, if they live within a reasonable driving distance. And then oftentimes we have that generational distance from the farm. So they don't live nearby, and it's because they've inherited the land from their parents and they've moved on. They went to college and they moved on to a different job. And, in the case of Kansas, they live in Kansas City, or they live in Denver, or they live down in Texas. And so what are their perceptions of commercial agriculture, and what do they understand about farm practices, farm policy, and commodity markets? I had one farmer call me from Western Kansas, and he said, the farm just changed hands, and the children have inherited the farm now. And he said, they want me to grow all organic wheat. And he was not an organic producer. And, that was a tough conversation, because it doesn't fit in his operation to switch to organic. But that was the perception of these new landowners, was that they wanted to have an organic wheat farm. And so we had to talk about, what that conversation was going to look like, and how he could convince them that what he was doing still had environmental benefits. He happened to be no-till. So we talked a little bit about that, and maybe convincing them that you didn't have to be organic to be environmentally sensitive and beneficial on their farm. So how did this landowner obtain the land? Did they inherit it or did they purchase it? And that was the question. You can see we're split about 55, 45 on this. And so the number of what we see with landowners inheriting versus purchasing it is oftentimes a difference in attitude towards the land. If you purchase it, those folks tend to approach this as a business relationship right off the bat. Whereas if you inherit it, sometimes there's some emotional baggage that comes along with that piece of land, and a desire to maybe honor their parents or their grandparents and maintain that relationship and try to do things. Landowners, this is going to sound bad, but they are oftentimes looking for what is, I call the F word, which is fair. And so they just want to be fair. And that's always an interesting concept. What one person thinks is fair isn't necessarily what another person thinks is fair. So landowners have these different attitudes towards return on investment, and it can be interesting to work with. I'll just mention on a personal level that I inherited land when my dad passed away when I was 20 years old. And I got my first experience being a landowner at a very young age. And what was interesting was that at the time, my tenant his name was Bob, and I called him up and I said, well, Bob, guess what? I want to continue working with you, but I was in school at the time at Montana State University, and I had taken an ag law class. And so I felt like I knew everything that I needed to know to be a good landowner. And so what I knew from that class was that I needed a written lease. And so I called Bob and I said, guess what? I've got this lease template and I filled it out, and I want to send it to you and have you fill it out, and we'll kind of go back and forth until we get something that we like. And after I said that, there was complete silence on the other end of the phone. And finally, Bob said, don't you trust me? Your dad and I had a handshake agreement for all those years, and now you want to have a written lease. And it really caught me off guard, because that wasn't what I meant at all. But it was the difference in philosophy or attitude or just thoughts about business relationships that different landowners have. Now, we ended up going forward with the lease as written. He agreed to that, and then within a few years, we had switched to a handshake agreement, because we got to the point where we kind of understood each other and understood what was going on, and we didn't renew the written lease. We switched to a handshake. So things can be different when you inherit versus purchase the land. So leasing information, keys to relationships or communication. So how often do you meet or interact with the landowner? I was happy to see with this particular survey that most of my tenants are meeting 5+ times per year. If I had to guess, this is with the landowners that live nearby and that it's easy to go visit with them. But there are some folks who don't meet very often, and those are the ones that we really want to keep working on, because that communication is incredibly important. The majority of the problems that I saw with landowner-tenant relationships where extension would get a phone call was a communication breakdown, and expectations were not lined up between the two parties. So when it comes to, and it will, that year that things didn't go well and we need to have a tough talk on whether or not we're going to raise the rent this next year or keep it steady, those those talks are much easier if you've got a good line of communication going with your landowner and if you've kept them updated on farming practices and market conditions up until that point. And that's what I try to convey to farmers is I know that this is your business and you want to keep things kind of close to the vest in terms of your personal financials, and that's completely understandable. But if your landowner doesn't understand what's going on with the profitability of the farm, then it's going to be a lot harder for them to understand when it comes time for you to say, look, we can't raise the rent this year because it's not a good time. And they may not understand if they haven't been kept up to date on what's going on. Okay, so who do you lease from? Mostly from individuals, but we've also got groups and trusts and other, which tends to be school districts or state lands. And we have different conversations with neighbors versus with a banker or a lawyer that would represent a group of siblings or a trust. So this again is an interesting dynamic that some of us have dealt with firsthand. And I've had groups of siblings talk to me about, and they always nominate one person to be the go-between, and it's a very high stress position for that sibling to be in because they're trying to represent their family and the wishes of all the different siblings that they represent and still work with the farmer. So sometimes in these situations, they'll come to the decision that they're going to work with a professional farm manager. And I think that can be a good thing just to try to manage the group dynamic in that situation. So perceptions of commercial farming, is the landowner a retired farmer or rancher? Yes or no? The understanding of farm programs, market practices, or farming practices and markets, and the likelihood of a cash rent versus a crop share. Retired landowners or retired farmers and ranchers who are now landowners do tend to understand how crop shares work, and so they might be more open to the possibility of using a crop share. And then how long have you been renting from this person or entity? So this is really revealing, I think, is that most people have, or the average is almost 18 years that they've been renting from this person. And so these relationships are longstanding. They're not terribly short-lived. And you can see in the histogram on the right that we've got some people who have been renting from the same person for 40 to 50 years. And that's not uncommon. And so these are generational leases. And one of the things that I always tell people is, you've got the opportunity to really you've been given this relationship. If you work with it, if you cultivate it, it can last for a long time. Just don't take it for granted that because they've been renting from your parents or your grandparents for a couple of generations that you can just treat them any way you want to and that they're going to take it. That's not necessarily the case. So how many landlords do you have? This is going back to that conversation I had where we oftentimes have a lot of landowners that we're working with, depending on the size of the farm. You can see the most common is 4 to 5 landowners. So I really recommend that the more landowners you have, the more willing you are to do things like newsletters or a website or some kind of group communication just to help you kind of keep on top of it. If you're going to do it for one person, you might as well do it for the whole group. I did have one producer tell me that he had a daughter who was going off to college, and she was really interested in coming back to the farm, but hadn't really found her place in terms of what it was she was going to do and how she was going to help. And he put her in charge of the newsletter because she had better communication skills than he did, better ability to manage a computer and put things together. And it was really good for her because it helped her to understand what was going on the farm herself and then communicate that to landowners. So we can set this up ourselves. We can bring family members into it. There's lots of options there. So leasing in practice. Communication by the tenant, all right? Current market and production conditions, new technologies, farm policy, conservation practices, all of those things. We get together as farmers and we talk about these issues all the time. But our landlords don't necessarily invest the same amount of time in understanding the business as farmers will. I had one extension agent tell me that she had a phone call from a lady in Wichita who owned some land in South Central Kansas. She'd been watching the news and heard that the weather was pretty good, and therefore she figured that her rent should go up because the weather had been good. So that was the connection that she made. Well, that's a stretch. And her farmer needs to be able to tell her, well, the weather's been good. And that means, yes, we had good yields, or no, these other mitigating factors, apply in this situation. So we want to make sure that we're talking about the different issues going on in ag that we sometimes think that our landowners don't care about. And some landowners, I'll give you, don't want an overabundance of information, but some of them want to feel like they're being brought into this as a business and as a business partner. And so you want to be able to offer them the option of having this kind of information. Preferences for fixed cash leases by landowners, it reduces the information burden, but I'll just warn you that those, like I said, you don't want to be in a situation where you're just dropping the check in the mail and that's the extent of your communication. And then transition plans by aging landowners and tenants. We're going to talk about succession planning on the tenant side, but I always like to mention succession planning on the landowner side. And oftentimes, I had one farmer in my office in Kansas at K-State, and he was on his way to Kansas City. And he was all dressed up, and I asked him what he was doing in Kansas City, and he's like, well, I'm going to a funeral. And I said, oh, and he's like, yeah, my landowner passed away, and so I'm going to meet the next generation. Well, that's not where you want to meet the next generation if it's at all possible. What you really want to be able to do is you want to be able to say, the next time your kids are in town for a holiday, why don't you bring them by the place and we'll sit down and have a cup of coffee and we'll talk about what we do here, what our ideas are, how we've managed the place up until now, and how they, will eventually fit into this, so that they have a relationship with that tenant when they do eventually take over, if that's the plan from the landowner side. So how do you view the other person? These are just a few issues that have come up in talking to people. My landlord doesn't need to know the yields because they might raise the rent on me. That's not a philosophy that I subscribe to. I feel like this ground belongs to the landlord. They should be privy to information like yields and what crops are being planted. I've had landowners call me who wanted some help just figuring out where they might get set up in terms of their negotiating a rent. And I said, well, the way we start that is we put together a spreadsheet that looks at cost of production. So I said, do you have any information on yields from your farm? And they'll say, no, I don't know what yields have been. They also will sometimes tell me they don't even know what crops are being planted. And so we can really get a little bit skewed on how much information we're sharing. My landlord is wealthy and doesn't need more rent from me. Their individual income is irrelevant to the situation. And my landlord can take the land away at any time. And while that is very true, landowners tend to put up with a lot before they will get rid of a tenant. I'll give you a story that just sort of demonstrates how hard it is to give up a tenant, no matter what's going on. And I had a colleague at K-State, Kevin Duvetter, and he was giving a talk out in Western Kansas. And a lady came up to him afterwards, and it was a talk kind of like the one I'm giving today. And the lady came up to him afterwards and she said, I think after hearing you speak, that maybe I should get a new tenant. And Kevin said, okay, well, why is that? And she said, well, because when it comes time to renegotiate, they tell me here's how much we'll pay for it, take it or leave it, and good luck finding anybody else to rent this farm. And so she said, I think I'm probably not being treated very well, and maybe it's time to find somebody else. And he said, okay, well, that sounds good. And he's like, I think you can do that. And she's like, well, would anybody else rent my ground? And he asked her, how many acres do you have? And she said, I've got 6 irrigated circles. And in Western Kansas, that's a pretty good piece of ground. And he kind of laughed and said, yes, you can find somebody else to rent that. And she said, well, how would I do that? And he said, well, why don't you try just putting an ad in the paper? And a couple months later, she reconnected with Kevin and said, I wanted just to follow up with you and tell you how things turned out. And she said, I did put an ad in the paper and I found a new tenant and he's very good and he talks to me and we have a good relationship. And she said, it's working out very well. She said, the only downfall to this whole situation is I don't have Thanksgiving dinner with my daughter and son-in-law anymore. And that's a situation where I talk to people about renting from family and I say, don't take for granted that they're going to rent to you because you have to treat them well. Okay, so my tenant doesn't make a lot of money farming and has a family to support. People have said that to me. I just tell them, as long as you understand that you are subsidizing them and that's what you want to do, then that's fine. But as a business relationship, it shouldn't be expected. They're the only person I know who would be willing to farm my land. That's obviously not true. We can always find somebody else. And oftentimes there's some really good people out there who would be willing to farm your land. They rented from my parents and I have an obligation to keep the lease in the family. That's where I talk about the emotional baggage that comes along sometimes with inherited ground. And that can wear off pretty quickly if they're not being treated well. And they don't have time to explain farming to me. So I had a lady come to me and she said, I would really like to talk to my farmer, but I don't want to bother him. And I told her, I said, you know, he rents this ground from you. It's important ground to him. He is going to take the time to have a cup of coffee with you. You just need to ask, and you just need to express a little bit of interest in the farm, and that will give him an opening to start to talk to you. So that's so business partner, full information helps to set an equitable rent, right? We want to share yields. Share information. You don't have to share your direct production costs, but you can share some overall information on what's going on. Sometimes what we do is take KFMA data or FBFM data and say, this is what the average farm in Kansas or in Illinois is looking like. These are what the top and the bottom, and we set somewhere in between. And give them an idea of what it costs to farm, because I think a lot of landowners don't necessarily understand that. And then that gives you a basis for negotiating rents. As I mentioned, personal wealth is irrelevant, and finding a new tenant, search costs sometimes keep landowners from switching often, but they will, if they're not treated well, eventually switch and find a new tenant. And landowner mistakes, failing to communicate with the tenant. So I put this on the landowner as much as I put it on the tenant, which is you have to be willing to ask questions and kind of put yourself out there and say, hey, I'd like to understand more about what's going on. I think for some landowners, they feel like if they don't understand what's going on, that they are somehow at a huge disadvantage in the negotiating situation, and therefore they don't want to sort of let you know that they don't know what's going on. But I tell them they really need to talk with their tenant. If they affect the usability of the land and don't compensate the tenant, such as, you know, leasing out the ground for hunting and expecting that you're going to get your cattle off early, or that you're going to leave some feed for the deer, these are things that you don't want to do without compensating the tenant in some way. Expecting certain production practices that may not be profit maximizing. If you say no double cropping or undergrazing to preserve habitat, those are things that you've got to realize that you are affecting the profitability of farming that piece of ground. And expecting a high rate of return based on what you paid for the land, not the rental market. And I know that rental markets have been crazy for the last several years. But we've also had situations where people have paid a lot of money for ground and they're looking for a particular return on that ground. And we just have to understand that the rental market is a supply and demand driven market, and it's not just based on what you paid for the land. And this is probably the biggest mistake that landowners make, is expecting the current tenant to make up for the mistakes of past tenants. And that is what I've seen is I've seen them take a written lease and they just add addendum after addendum after addendum, trying to protect themselves from all the things that if they had a bad tenant that they want to try to protect themselves from, or things that they might anticipate. You can't write a lease that protects you from everything that might possibly go wrong. Communication and having a good relationship is what's going to keep things able to respond to changes in the situation and being able to adjust and keep expectations in line. But you cannot expect a current tenant to make up for mistakes made by past tenants. So tenant mistakes, it's the same one, right? So here was the first one: failing to communicate with the tenant. Tenant mistakes: failing to communicate with the landowner. If I haven't made it clear that I care about communication, that's my last plug. Using informal bonuses during good years. Okay, why would I say this? Because sometimes we negotiate a cash rent that is not sufficient given the outcome of prices and yields for that year, and you want to share a little bit more with the landowner for that year. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with doing that. And if you explain to the landowner what it is you're doing and why you're doing it, that it was a unique year, yields were exceptionally good, prices were exceptionally good, something drove that higher profitability, and that's why you want to do it. What we don't want to do is just kind of add a little extra on top of the usual check and just say, hey, I just wanted you to know it was a good year, here you go. Because they will develop expectations that whatever they thought that year was like, that the next year might be the same way. And so those informal bonuses can actually end up kind of coming around to bite you if you don't explain why you're giving them. Treating the current landowner as less than a full business partner, even if they don't say anything, the next generation may not appreciate this. Using foot in the door payments and finding they aren't profitable, and rationalizing stagnant rents as a result of that is a mistake. So renting to young and beginning farmers. This is an issue that we're talking about a lot because, as we mentioned, the average age of farmers is around 60. And so USDA is anticipating a fair number of retirements happening over the next 10 to 15 years, and that we have a lot of young and beginning farmers that we want to try to bring into the industry. And so Ray Massey, who is at the University of Missouri, he and I got together and we had a group of landowners from Kansas and Missouri that we did a focus group with. And at the beginning of the focus group, we asked them, we said, what's your interest in renting to young and beginning farmers? And they said, oh, we really want to do that. That's important to us. We would definitely rent to them. And then we got into the focus group meeting, and we'd been going for a while, and we were using clickers so that they could respond anonymously to our questions. And so we posed this question to them. You currently get $100 an acre for your land. A 30-year-old farmer offers you $100 an acre, and a 60-year-old farmer offers you $110. Who do you rent to? And the response from them was, instead of everybody saying that they would rent to the 30-year-old farmer like they did at the beginning of the meeting, it was split right down the middle, half and half. And so it was really interesting. We asked them, why? Why did some of you pick that extra $10 from the 60-year-old farmer when you had, expressed some interest in renting to young and beginning farmers? And they really jumped on this idea of experience, and that experience was really important to them because it was a form of minimizing risk exposure. That they knew that 60-year-old farmer should know what they were doing, would be more likely to make the rent payment, would be more likely to just sort of follow through on things, and they were uncertain about the 30-year-old farmer. Then they made the argument that if that 30-year-old farmer was very transparent with their financials and with their cost of production and with a lot of their business information, that would make up for some of that experience that they lacked. And so it was interesting. We've had landowners basically say, as long as we have good personal references and a willingness on the part of those young producers to share their business financials, then we would be more interested in renting to them. And that's a tough one for young producers because some of them feel like, well, I shouldn't have to share my business financials with my landlord. But we're working on a study right now at K-State where we're surveying both landowners and young producers and trying to sort of find where that middle ground might be for them. And then the potential for social capital, as I mentioned, with the young farmers making an investment in the relationship, that if they're willing to take good care of the relationship with their landowner, they can build up that social capital or trust a little more quickly than just sort of, you know, not ignoring the relationship, but not nurturing it either. Okay, so who has more power in negotiating lease terms, the landowner or the tenant? So take a moment here to think about which you think it is. We don't have the opportunity to answer, but I want you to think about this. And then here in just a second, I'll show you what happens when I ask this question of most audiences. So who has more power in negotiating lease terms? And this is the answer that I oftentimes get, is that landowners have the more power. And that's an interesting answer because I think that tenants have more power than we sometimes give credit to. Farmers tend to have better information on the rental rates, on market and production conditions, on technology, and on government programs. And with that information, they are oftentimes able to negotiate you know, a little bit better than maybe some landowners who don't understand those things. Now, the landowners have the land, and that is where, you know, we kind of view it as, well, they'll get whatever price they want because they have the land. Well, it doesn't always work that way in practice. So I think it's a more nuanced question than what you might first think. Okay, so remember, communication is the key to success. And talking during the good times will make talking during the bad times easier. Don't let the only conversations that you have be the ones about lowering the rent. And where to from here? Okay, so I just wanted to say a few things real quick before we open this up for Q&A. One of it is, you know, what affects your land's value is how it can be used, thinking about crop rotation or grazing plans. What factors affect its value, tillage practices, weed control, quality of fences, if we're talking about pasture, and who are your potential renters. Location is important, and your willingness to search for new ones and to kind of go through that process of trying to find a new tenant. Okay, and keeping up with the basics of the agricultural markets, I say this to both landowners and tenants. And if you are a tenant, being willing to share this information with your landlords and kind of point them to resources that will help them to understand what's going on and understand about the negotiate, not just negotiating the rental rate, but managing the entire operation and feeling good about how it's being managed, and that there's a lot of times when we survey landowners and we ask them questions about what's most important to them, getting the highest rent is not ranked the highest. Having a well-managed farm that is managed well for future generations tends to rank highest. So we want to share that information with them. Okay, so leasing relationships, invest your time to improve the leasing relationship. And when you find the landowner or tenant who works well with you, I recommend you take a tip from the lady that I met in North Central Kansas and bake them cookies. All right, so now I am open to questions.
Yes, thank you, Mykel, for your presentation. We do have some time now for some questions before our next speakers come on. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We do have a couple questions ready here for you. When you see, in your experience, when you see land transition, do you find that the heirs of whoever inherited that land stick to what the deceased producer had done before, or do you generally see that structure change as far as if it was a cash rent or crop share, switching to a different type of lease?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I see the initial couple of years being, let's just stick with what we've been doing. Because there's a familiarity with that. Like I said, when heirs inherit ground, sometimes there's just an initial situation of, what are we going to do with this land? Are we going to rent it? Are we going to sell it? Are we going to custom farm it? What are we going to do with it? And so the easiest thing to do is to just stick with the status quo, and do that for a couple of years before they make any decisions about making major changes to it. And most people will do that. Most people are not, as soon as they get the land, we're going to sell it. So that's kind of the general conversation that we have with new heirs. But there is, like I said, we've seen an increase in the use of cash leases. And so it wouldn't surprise me in the least if there was a desire on their part to go to something that they understood a little bit better, and to switch to that cash lease. And so that's where the farmer has to kind of be willing to say, okay, well, I can do that, but here's what maybe we should do with that lease, and here's how we should set it up.
Perfect. And as far as at that same transition time, what's your biggest piece of advice for producers as far as, when the transition happens? You talked a little bit on, meeting the next generation and when the best time to do that is, but what's one piece of advice as far as when that transition happens for producers to do?
So I think it's recognizing that you've got some folks that may be a little bit overwhelmed by all of a sudden being owners of farmland. Especially if they have not been privy to the business dealings up until that point. And so, if you don't know the tenants, or if you don't know the heirs, and if they were not told the things that were going on, all they can kind of do is observe, and so they don't know much. So you really want to be open and forthcoming with information and say, this is what we've been doing on the farm, and this is why. What I recognized with like when my grandparents passed away and we had a different tenant, was that there was just an expectation on his part that we were going to not only continue renting to him, but that we weren't going to ask any questions about what he was doing and why. And I think that was a mistake on his part, because we were kind of curious about why things had been done the way they were. And so being forthcoming with that information before, just have it ready to go. And that's going to help you start that relationship, start that communication flow with them.
Perfect. Yeah. The next question that we have here kind of goes back to the communication. I know you hit quite a few times that it's important to make sure, landowners are keeping in contact with tenant and vice versa. What do you have any research or anything that recommends what landowners versus tenants like, which kind of communication they like best, whether they like it to be in person, via phone call? I know you talked about several different things. Is there anything that most people favor?
Yeah, so that's the challenging part. I was talking to a very large farmer out in Western Kansas, and I thought he said it best when he said different landowners require different levels of touch. Okay, so some landowners are going to be very low maintenance, I'll say. They don't need a lot of information. They just, want to know that you're doing a good job and that you provide a little bit of information. Other landowners are going to want to know what's going on all the time. And so you have to sort of, you can't just assume that I've got 10 landlords, I can treat them all the same. You have to get to know each of them a little bit better and figure out what it is their interest, what they need from you in terms of communication. Is a newsletter sufficient? For some of them, it would be great. For some of them, they're going to want a phone call or some pictures or, a cup of coffee. that's going to be required. And so, you're going to have to make that decision about, how much you want to invest in that relationship and if it's worth it to you. But I would say in most cases, it doesn't take that much extra to make it a good relationship.
Yeah, perfect. And you talked a little bit as well about young producers and how, in your experience with discussing with landowners, what makes them want to rent or crop share with a young producer, and the transparency piece there. There are probably a lot of people that wouldn't be as comfortable sharing in-depth financials with outside people. Do you have any suggestions as far as different ways for young producers to get their foot in the door, as far as managing that relationship, introducing themselves to landowners, just how to make that all work that would be a different way than just showing, their bottom line numbers?
I think what I tell them is you put together a portfolio of your work, just like you would if you were applying for a job, right? You put together your philosophy of farming. Take the time to write out a statement that says, this is who I am and this is what's important to me. And, I'm married with 2 young kids, and my spouse and I do all of these types of things. And these are the things that matter to us with regard to our production practices, and, just really outline it, and then get personal references. Just like you would, again, for a job, is to be able to have people who can sort of vouch for your ability to be a good producer and a reliable tenant. And those are things that, in the past, we've kind of let, as long as you knew the family, right, then you kind of were willing to take a chance on them. But some young producers don't have family that they can, lean on to introduce them to the community and to landowners. And so the other thing that I've seen be very successful is mentoring programs, finding other farmers who are willing to mentor you, and through that process that they will introduce you to landowners and sort of start that conversation. So a lot of farmers, a lot of people are willing to help a young person out if they see a lot of try on their part. And so those are some things.
Perfect. Well, I think that was all the questions that we had come through. So if there's any last minute ones, go ahead and put them in the box below or in the Q&A box. But other than that, thank you, Mykel, for answering questions and for being on the webinar with us today. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next speakers of the morning. But just a final reminder to the audience that if you are a CCA, don't forget to claim your 1 CEU in professional development for this session. You can either scan the QR code on the screen or email our team with your CCA number to be submitted for the credit. I'd now like to introduce our next speakers, Bob Ray and Alyssa Stewart, presenting Estate Planning in 2021, Here and Now. This workshop will focus on estate valuation, estate tax calculation, and how to navigate estate and transition planning in 2021. The presentation team will provide detailed examples and techniques for attendees to consider in their operation. Presenting this workshop is Bob Ray, CEO of Illinois FBFN, and Alyssa Stewart, attorney. Bob Ray has assisted farmers with accounting, tax and consulting services in West Central Illinois through the Illinois FBFM Association since 1984. He prepares over 550 tax returns annually, completes business analysis reports each year for farm families, and prepares detailed financials for larger farm operations, along with making approximately 300 farm business visits each year. As an instructor for the University of Illinois Tax School, Bob presents at farm and tax update seminars, reaching an audience of over 1,500 tax preparers. Bob's formal education includes degrees from John Wood Community College, Western Illinois University, and the University of Illinois. Alyssa Stewart joined the firm in June 2008. She currently resides in Burlington, Iowa with her husband, Steve, and 2 energetic children. She is actively involved in the local community through her service on various boards and in her church, where she serves on various committees. Alyssa's practice is a general practice, including but not limited to the areas of estate planning, probate, and estate administration, real estate, business law, and taxation. Bob and Alyssa, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Emily, I'm checking my audio. Is my audio working for you, Emily?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. And Alyssa, say hello to everybody. So we make sure your audio is working as well. Alyssa?
Good morning. Can you see the screen? Is it screen sharing okay?
Screen share is good. We see you, we hear you loud and clear. So welcome everybody to this next portion of the Agribusiness Management Program with your sponsors of Illinois Soybean, FBFM, Farm Doc, Illinois Farm Bureau, and the Farm Financial Standards Council. Alyssa and I will enjoy the next 45 minutes or so with you, describing our experiences in estate planning. It's been my pleasure to work with Alyssa's firm and in partnership with FBFM for, gosh, Alyssa, I bet it's over 30 years probably. Alyssa's not been involved that long, but I certainly have. They have been.
Yeah, don't age me, Bob. Don't age me.
Yeah,
like
I'll leave that part blank. But their firm has been a stalwart in Western Illinois, assisting farm families in a variety of legal matters, none more important currently than estate planning in 2021, here and now. So Alyssa's going to run the screen. So good morning, Alyssa. I'll let you open the commentary, and Alyssa's going to first describe what's normal. My goodness, Alyssa, I can't wait to hear what you're thinking about. What is normal in estate planning? Go ahead, please.
Well, what's normal is there's no normal. A lot of times I always tell clients when they come in and we start talking about a plan, whether it's a new plan or consideration for changing an old plan, is that generally there's two reasons you're here. One is to avoid taxes, and that's generally the most important one. The other is to make sure that what you want to happen post-death happens, whether that's a division and there's always and I think Mykel mentioned it, fair and equal, and what that means or what it doesn't mean. And what I always find a lot with clients is, of course, that the estate tax is the most important when they walk in the door. And it is important because, those are high rates. I think what you come to at the end of the day, though, is that sometimes estate tax is not the only reason you're planning. And sometimes you may pay taxes, a little more taxes, but you may get to the outcome you're looking for in a control mechanism better. And so, although, again, most of the time we're all concerned about state taxes, there are more reasons to plan. And I think that's always important to remember, that there's a balance between all the goals and what all those goals are together. Currently, federal estate tax exemption is 11.7 million. So that is portable between couples, meaning if a spouse passes away and he or she doesn't use the 11.7, then that amount left carries over to the spouse, making sure that the 23.4, which is our highest ever, it covers the couple together. That was enacted in 2012, and I don't think there's been any discussion to stop portability. Now, current law does reset after what we call Trump's tax laws, back to 5 million adjusted for inflation at the beginning of 2026. So when we do planning, or when I do planning, I always say we're often forced to deal with the here and now. We know it's 11.7, but we also know that the next proposed tax law is 5 million. So we can look at some clients and say, you don't have a tax problem today, but not very many years from now, you're going to have a tax problem. And so there's always things that you have to juggle, and it's not easy. And it may mean that 3 years from now, you're making a change, or it may mean, you're accepting some taxes. Illinois estate tax, current exemption is 4 million. It is not portable between spouses. So I'll be honest, when I do my planning with my Illinois clients, most don't have, or are on the fringes of having a federal estate tax, but most people have an Illinois estate tax problem. And it's one of those things it's sort of weird, the interplay, because, you're not planning for what people think is being the big number, the federal number. Instead, you're planning for Illinois number, and you've got the federal on the fringes, and you have to figure out how they work together to make the plan work, but still to avoid taxes that occur at the Illinois level, but not the federal. And that, again, that's not portable. I think it would be better if it was portable. And I think at this point, there's not a lot of plans to change that 4 million. And so, again, a lot of your planning, when I'm planning with clients, is not just a state tax, but it's, do I have a federal problem versus an Illinois problem? And I know, Bob, we see that a lot in a lot of our mutual clients, is that there's no federal estate tax problem. it's an Illinois state tax problem. So all our planning is focused on how to reduce that one tax versus both taxes.
Yeah, that's shifted over 30 years. There used to be a lot of planning just on the federal, and Illinois was whatever it was as sort of a falling out of the pieces matter, but that's no longer the issue anymore. Illinois does require a lot of planning in advance. You know, the current law that resets to 5 million, you know, adjusted for inflation. So we would think that's maybe going to mathematically calculate into the mid to upper $6 million level 3 years from now, 5 years from now, when that would happen, depending on what inflation rates exist. So even though it resets to 5, it's really, as a practical matter, 6.5 to 7. But that's still a big reduction from the 23.4 couples exemption. The other comment I want to make about Illinois estate tax before you describe distribution content, Alyssa, is that Illinois tax rate is unusual in how it's affected. You know, the tax rate is 0 to 16%, but you'll see in our very first example, the effective rate is over 28% for the taxpayer example that we're going to show here in a moment. So don't let the tax tables guide you too directly. The only way to calculate that tax is to go to the Illinois Attorney General website. There's a calculator there. You put in a couple of numbers and it does the math for you. There's no tax table. There's no abacus. There's no comptometer. It's just do it on the website and it tells you the number. Very unusual how that's done. And again, that's an activity of the Illinois Attorney General, not the Department of Revenue. Alyssa, describe your comment about air distributions, because as you said, it's not only about the tax in planning, other issues might have greater priority.
Sure, Bob. I think that from my planning perspective, I do a lot of planning with farmers, and my biggest concern always becomes, how are you dealing with on-farm heirs? You know, there's always tends to be one child, if not two, farming, and one or two children who don't farm. And when you draft a will that says, I give everything equally to the three of them, or if there's three, however many children, I stopped at 2, probably should have stopped at 1. I don't know. It becomes a matter of, you just basically forced them to work through a whole lot of issues with no direction. So in theory, it means they each get an undivided ownership percentage in however many acres you own. And I can tell you that as easy as that sounds from the, I made a decision and now I'm done, at the back end, it can be nothing short of a nightmare, because maybe your land isn't divisible. Maybe one of them is going to force a sale, because that's what we know can happen with undivided interest. And so I always tell clients that simply saying, the days of saying equally to the 3 or equally to my children should be over, because unless you know that you don't have any on-farm heirs and it's all going to be sold, that's okay. That's just not most of my clients. You know, they don't want it sold. These are family farms, they're legacies. They want to hold these things together. And so, you know, there becomes a point where you have to dig much deeper than that. You have to go to, can I split the land up? And maybe I'm not going to be equal, but I'm going to be fair, in my opinion. And your opinion is the only one that matters. You're the, you know what, you're the owner, you're the farmer, you know what's there. I also think that to the extent you know that someone's going to want to be bought out, you have to address that, because a lot of times by the time your child is buying out a sibling, they're 65 or older. They don't want to go in debt for the next generation. It makes it very hard. You know, can we set a different price? Can we move assets of cash assets over to the one who wants cash assets and give the land to a different one? There's a lot of different planning tools that we can address, but if we don't do that at the same time that we're so worried about estate taxes, then at the end, what I see is that things get sold that we never intended to. And so I think that when you think about planning, you have to think about not just the estate tax aspect, which of course is important, but also if I have to sit back and think about what's going to happen when I'm gone, is it really going to play out the way I want it to? And did I take every step possible to try to make it play out? I mean, nothing's perfect. No plan's completely error-proof, but by taking more steps while you're planning, you can get a lot closer to error-proof than not.
Yeah, it's good. I think a variety of pieces for the parents who are planning this transition to think about, and taxes are one of those pieces. Alyssa lays out several good ones here. We're going to get a little bit of math. Alyssa, you can advance our slides. We'll look at the next one as we think about the proposals and low interest rates. Jump back to the low interest rates one. Is that the next one, Alyssa?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, terrific. Let's talk about that a little bit. And so this session includes an accountant and an attorney. So you're going to hear a lot of theory, but you're also going to hear a lot of math. And none of those may be precisely accurate for your operation, but we're here to provide as much education as we can today. There was a question I saw in the chat about what does Illinois estate tax apply to? We're going to talk about that in an upcoming slide in a moment. So keep those
I think I go
Q&As
back,
coming.
Bob, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll cover that one in a little bit. Low interest rates. So this is just the economic situation that we're in that might help transfer assets in a way we've never seen before. As we mentioned, the estate tax exemptions are the highest I've ever seen, and interest rates are the lowest we've ever seen. And we see that so much in the economic cycles today of what's going on. We are at extremes of a variety of economic conditions. So IRS publishes these every month for loans 3 years and less. Look at that interest rate, Alyssa, 0.12%. If you'd give me 12 points.
You got some money you want to loan me, Bob?
I think my goodness.
I'll pay you that.
Yeah, 0.12%. And if it's a 9-year or longer loan, 2.07. That's the long-term rate that IRS fixes. And there's no end to that number. That could be a 40-year, 2% loan that the seller could finance costs to the buyer. I just did a couple quick examples. If we want to transfer $300,000 in equipment, that interest cost over the 3 years is only $720. Look at $1 million of land over 9 years. That interest cost is only $106,000 to transfer that by a sale to make that transfer. So forget about gifting, forget about estate planning. Maybe you just want to sell some property. And so if you want to make things easier for the buyer and lock in low rates, that's another way to assist your asset transfer going forward while still providing income for the senior members of the family operation. Not everybody would be in a position to make a gift of $300,000, but a sale of $300,000 does not put as much interest burden on the buyer as historically it might have. These are also helpful if we think about rental rates. What's the fair rental on that building, on the grain bin setup? Well, one component of rent is a opportunity interest rate cost at these low rates. This is another tool to have available to help transfer assets besides gift, besides estates. Just one other way to do this during lifetime or post-death through a continuation of these contracts. Alyssa, you write a lot of rental and contract agreements. Interest rates are helping those transfers occur.
They're especially, I see it more from the equipment standpoint. I think a lot of people assume if I'm trying to facilitate reducing my estate, I'm trying to facilitate getting things to the on-farm heir early as part of my succession plan. Everyone just assumes it's a gift. It doesn't have to be a gift. Sometimes it's a part sale, part gift. But these kind of interest rates from an equipment standpoint, I can get that equipment transferred. And sometimes that's the thing that, we can sometimes wait to transfer land, but a lot of times equipment, if I'm not farming anymore, it's a bit of a liability. And so I need to get rid of it. And so a lot of times looking at these low interest rates and saying, okay, I'm going to deal with part of this now. It's not a gift, it's a sale. And I'm going to get some dollars out of it. So I didn't cut myself out of income with a gift, but I made it, feasible for the on-farm heir to take this over some number of years with a lower interest rate. Lower interest rates in general, from my perspective, are things that I encourage clients to consider in the planning process, not just because the IRS, sometimes we tie at some point in the future, these will be the rates. But we look at it from at some point, if you're going to force a buyout, one child wants bought out, then we say, do you really want them paying financing at financing rates at the prime rate or whatever that number is, your local, bank rate? A lot of times we'll say, go to that bank rate and reduce that interest rate. Because again, reducing interest rates is not the biggest thing you can do for them, but it definitely helps. And it helps them be able to make those payments as they're buying land, hopefully over time. Again, another planning tool. But yeah, interest rates, right now with the low interest rates, we're seeing a lot of equipment transfers as part of succession planning.
And that's a hard piece for non-farm and farming heirs to get right. So maybe a sale works, and low interest rates can help make that happen. Well, let's jump to that slide that's called what's included in an estate valuation, because we're talking about estate all the time. But let's just a quick reminder of what gets included in there. And the first one I listed was fair market value of assets. Alyssa can give us the legal definition of what that really means. But I put a couple things on the screen. So Alyssa, as you think about people deciding what's in that estate, you know, our job on the accountant side is adding up the numbers and telling you the total, but you're going to help us with the theory of what's includable and what is not.
And this is the point where if there are any bankers or financial advisors watching, they start to dislike me. Because I always tell clients, when you think about what's in your gross estate, think about everything you had control of 5 minutes before you died. And that's what's in your estate. Because a lot of people have been told, believe, have read that if I leave an asset to somebody through, like if somebody is the transfer on death beneficiary of something I own, then that's not included in my estate for estate tax purposes. And that is not correct. Now there's a whole separate argument, or there's a whole separate section of, is it controlled by your will? No, because it had a transfer on death beneficiary. But a lot of people believe that if I just make, you know, if I have a retirement account that has $1 million in it and I leave it to my children, well, that's not part of my estate. You can't charge me taxes on that. That is absolutely not accurate. There's a lot of nuances to what's included in an estate valuation. And then on top of it, it's not just what's included, it's how you value it. Willing buyer, willing seller. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. But again, as Bob has on the slide, it's usually determined by an independent appraisal. You know, Alyssa Stewart can't tell you what your ground is worth. You can't tell me what your ground is worth. Somebody who's independent, not really, you know, no dog in the fight, they're the ones who are going to tell us what the value is. So when we think about an estate valuation, we have to think about two things. What did I own and what is the value? And that value is not arbitrary. That value is established either by an appraisal if it's ground, sometimes a business appraisal if it's a farming entity, by what was actually in the bank account at the time, you know, what the market says if I own stock that is worth. And so obviously we get to subtract liabilities that are outstanding from that. And then certain things are also deductible on that return, funeral expenses, final expenses. However, there's also some of those final, well, executor and administrative expenses, those are deductible, but there's always a balance between, is it better to deduct them for estate tax or income tax, because you can't deduct them on both. And then again, how we value things, the bottom, lack of marketability and lack of control discounts. Those are ways that we decrease the value of specifically entities so that overall our estate valuation is less, thereby resulting in less taxes.
Yeah, we're trying to drive at what are things worth on that 5 minutes before, not only what did you own, but on that moment of death, what are those things worth at that moment in time? I had an interesting call a few years ago. We've always talked about, you know, this planning, and we've always said, boy, if I knew when I was going to die, I know what I would want to do. A farmer called me on Friday afternoon and said, you know, I've heard you say that phrase, and Dad's going to die Saturday or Sunday. What should we do today or tomorrow in that step? And I thought, wow, I don't know if I'm ready to answer that, but that's the question we've always posed to them, right? But we know with more certainty, you know, these days, in some cases when death might occur. So important to think about that. Well, let's go forward, Alyssa, and talk about the proposals and speculation that our Congress, our administration, and others are proposing. And really, maybe I'll just summarize the slide when I highlight in blue. There's a lot of speculation, but not much detail on any of these things yet. And I know last week, Christine Tigran, our friend from Iowa State, covered these proposals in great depth. And so maybe for today, all we're really going to say is there's nothing new. There's still speculation. There are a lot of proposals, and that just warrants everybody's attention and maybe communication with their legislative friends on what is happening and how might that impact us. How do you answer these questions, Alyssa? I know these questions come in your door probably every day. What's happening? What should we do?
Yeah. first I asked if they have an 8-ball, magic 8-ball, because it's about as good as we're going to get. But basically, I mean, I kind of go over with my clients, like Christine would have done last week, that these are the proposals. You know, obviously the biggest one, in my opinion, that we talk about the most is the transfer tax, which I think we'll talk about shortly. I've basically been telling clients that the first thing you need to do is you need to be prepared, but you're not probably going to do anything until we learn more as we get closer to the end of the year to know if we need to use up, you know, the 11.7 exemption by making gifts or part sale, part gift, things like that. One thing that I tell clients is at this point, you want to spend some time getting a true value of your net worth. A lot of my older farm clients will come in with a balance sheet or something they prepared for the bank, and according to them, their ground is worth $4,000 an acre. And then I offer to buy it at $4,000 an acre, and they're not interested in selling it at $4,000.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know. But basically it's a true value. And so I've been telling clients, and a lot of clients have gotten appraisals this year, and it takes a while to get an appraisal right now with the market doing what it's doing and things like that. They've gotten an appraisal. They know what their true value is based on an independent appraiser, so that we can run those numbers in a quick situation and make gifts. I mean, unless you're making a gift of cash, which is not generally my farming client's position, then you're either going to make a gift of land, or you're going to make a gift of an entity or some equipment, something along those lines that isn't just easily transferable. You can't just write the check today. And so basically, I've been telling all my clients, you need to have a pretty idea what you're worth, so you understand if these things come into play, how they will impact you, so that then you can make a decision if you do need to do anything before the end of the year, which again, we're all speculating that's when it all happens. We don't know that. It could be retroactive. So it's a lot of be prepared, but we're not going to do anything in the moment. And I think on some level, that's an unfortunate, I hate giving that to clients. I hate telling clients that, because I didn't really say anything, but that's the reality of where we are. We don't know. There's no detail. There's not much detail. So even any bit of planning as to how it might impact you, as you'll see in the slides when we calculate numbers, it's all just speculation on our part.
Well, let's get into one of those that are proposed losses of the current benefits, and then we'll talk about something that's potentially added to our current stream of calculations and processes. But this step up in basis is one of the proposals that would be diminished. But Alyssa, walk us through how step up basis begins to work. And then let me describe the blue piece, because that's really the fun part for the accountant side is, hey, we get to do these things all over again, and we're going to save some money along the way. But tell us about step up basis.
Sure.
How critical that is.
Step up in basis, which I think is like been here since the 40s. So I'm assuming that predates me and you, right, Bob?
It does, yes.
It is basically the theory that at the time I pass away, that my new tax basis is the fair market value as of date of death. Prior to that, if I paid $200 an acre for a farmland and I sold it for $4,000 an acre, the difference is what I'm going to pay capital gain tax on. At death, and I always say, and this is probably morbid, but there's truly only one benefit to dying, and it's step up in basis. At that time, if the ground you paid $200 an acre for is now worth $4,000, which probably is worth a lot more, your children or your heirs take a step up to $4 million at the time of passing. So then if they do decide to sell it, then they don't have tax on it. Realistically, it's less about sale and more about kind of the next things that Bob's going to hit on, but it basically kind of wipes away that gain and puts you on an even playing field to fair market value, which is also why I tell clients who tend to not want to go get those appraisals, what if you're at the low end of fair market value in your, because fair market value it's subjective. Yeah, it's a range. I could get 4 appraisals and they'd all say something different. Nobody's going to match. So what if you happen to be at the low end of that and you have estate tax room to be at the high end of that? You want to be at the high end of that. So you want to make sure that you're not undershooting when you're valuing your property. But in terms of the step up in basis, it kind of just occurs. We document the value and that's your new basis. And then we turn it over to the accountants and they do all the hard work.
Well, yeah, but that's the fun part. I mean, really, and essentially what is occurring is the decedent's property is being taxed in the estate tax world when they're filing their federal estate tax return. Now, in many cases, there's an exemption that eliminates that tax, but is still being as if taxed at death based on their balance sheet items. And so once it's taxed again, the heirs then acquire that property with this new basis. And from the accounting side, we get to recalculate depreciation. If we're going to sell any inventory, corn, beans, cattle, hogs, we get a new value for those, and those are going to be increased in inventory tax basis, and we can sell them essentially at no gain if they're sold, right away. If the decedent owned a partnership or had corporate stock, those assets get a new basis, and there's different ways how it happens in one entity versus the other. But essentially, they get new basis in those items that will either provide them additional current deductions or shield any sale proceeds from tax sometime later. And for our clients that have S Corps and C Corps and land in those entities, there's some really cool things that can be done to make sure you liquidate your land and your stock in the same year and avoid some of this double taxation treatment and maximize the opportunities that exist. But think about equipment, breeding hogs, breeding livestock, buildings, tile, fertility, all those get set again based on this appraisal number and go on the heirs depreciation schedule with the date of the farmer's death, the description, the cost at that point in time, and starting depreciating again, equipment over 5 or 7 years, breeding stock over 3, whatever those numbers. These are very valuable calculations for the surviving heirs of the farmer and can shield those heirs from tax liability for quite an extended period of time. And it's important to plan that out so we don't forfeit deductions as well. And the problem here is under the AFP, this whole piece is removed and everybody gets a carryover basis, meaning the heirs get the basis that the decedent had. If he had 0 basis in grain, that's what they get, 0 basis, and they will start paying tax as soon as those assets are sold, liquidated, or in the case of equipment, traded away. You can still get a new basis, but only by paying this new transfer tax that we'll discuss next. Alyssa, any follow-up on step up in basis? It's so critical because even people who are far away from the 11 million or 4 million number have a huge benefit by these calculations.
Well, we think of so often just reducing estate tax, but it's also about the income tax. There's so much interplay between what happens at death and how it impacts income taxes. The other, equipment, breeding, buildings, clients are always shocked when I'm asking for, well, do you have any inputs you've paid that are sitting around that we haven't put on the field, timing of death, and like, well, yeah, but those have been paid for. I'm like, yep, and now we own them, and now we're going to rededuct them, and they're just sort of like, really? I think that it's always important to be prepared to break down your assets. A lot of people want to tell me, well, I'm worth 8 million. What's that 8 million comprised of? Because it will impact some of your planning in that aspect, especially with the income tax interplay.
Right, just as one quick example, if I have an IRA, I don't get a new basis in my IRA account, but if I have a combine, I do. So the character of assets is extremely important.
Yeah. Now, if you think about the American Families Plan and the reduction in basis gives me so much angst, and not just about the transfer tax, but most clients can't tell me what their basis is in their land now, and they're alive. Trying to recreate basis from however many years ago is a nightmare in and of itself. I mean, a lot of times we don't worry about it. Client's never going to sell. They're going to die, step up in basis. That's our new basis. Trying to calculate what they might have paid for and what's been depreciated out in terms of fertility, tile, etc. It's a lot of work. Everybody's going to struggle from that end if that were to come into play.
Agreed. Well, let's talk about one of the new proposals. Again, still a proposal, still an idea, not the law. This is a proposed idea, but this is along with the step up of basis loss. This is the key piece that makes people call this and say, what should we do about this thing? And we're going to talk a bit about this, and we have a good example that'll describe the differences between current law and the proposal. So Alyssa, first, the background on this new transfer tax, and it happens not only at death, but also during a gift during your lifetime.
Yeah. The transfer tax is so weird. I mean, it's just, in my mind, it's just nothing we've dealt with. Because so often we think about estate taxes as, I'm taxing you because you died and you're worth X. I mean, that's sort of the basic breakdown of it all. The transfer taxes is I'm now taxing when you make a transfer. Now in Iowa, we do have an inheritance tax that is a bit like a transfer tax. And I've always said my entire career, it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. And now it's not the dumbest thing I've ever seen, because this is now the dumbest thing I've ever
Oh,
seen.
Alyssa, just hang on another 5 or 10 or 30
Yeah.
years, and that'll keep your list.
It'll circle back around. But basically, the theory being that you don't get a step up in basis. And, I could probably, wrap my head around, I have to take it with a carryover basis like I do with a gift. And then they turn around and say, you don't get a step up, and there's a new transfer tax just by the effective transfer of it, not because there's actually a taxable event. I spend so much of my time saying, well, you don't need to worry about it because it's not a taxable event. This is a taxable event all of a sudden. Dying and leaving something to my heirs has become a taxable event beyond our concept of estate tax. Basically, the fair market value at date of death and your carryover basis at that moment, whether you sell it or not, there's a tax due. Now, there are some theoretical things they're saying might reduce that number, some numbers for gains on residence. I think Christine talked about that. The potential that we each will get $1 million exemption, the potential that, and Bob will talk about it in a little bit, I think, but that if somebody continues to operate the business, in our mind, that's always the farm, then you get to defer the tax. Deferral is not an exemption. And so at some point, someone's going to pay the tax. And so it's all of a sudden on top of your estate tax, it's a whole different tax that occurs whether you do anything or, I mean, all you did was die, and now this tax is going to occur because I leave it to someone.
That's right. It's a very different concept. We have it just a little bit of that now with the way we handle machinery trades. Those are essentially transfers, but that gain is taxed. But we have an offsetting increased purchase price that covers that anyway. But we have, I guess, maybe a bit of a model that these transfers that were never thought to be a taxable event before kind of are creeping into that neighborhood these days. And I highlighted in blue on the screen, the own and operate the farm. To avoid paying that tax immediately, someone has to own and operate that farm. I should have said a related party heir has to own and operate that farm. And so, if I'm owning the 40 acres and farming it, but my sister owns the next 40 and farming it, and I'm operating it, I'm not sure that her 40 is going to qualify for deferral. She owns it. And if she's cash renting it to me, she's not operating it. Back to some of Mykel's comments, rental arrangements might need to be rethought as we think about how this could potentially impact us if it ever comes to happen. Well, listen,
that was kind of one of the first things, Bob, that came to my mind when I started, reading about it was, well, there's a lot of people who are going to become farmers now.
Well, that could be.
Before.
That could be, and who is a farmer? A whole broad definition there, and but you're right. They're going to make a lot of people qualify or desire to qualify.
Try to qualify to get that deferral. Yeah.
Well, the estate tax exemption is another piece that's being targeted. So Alyssa will describe a bit of that for us. And Alyssa, give us a couple more details on the GST as well. We've talked a bit about that for our clients. I'm surprised how often that kind of makes sense.
It does. So this is one thing that is even more speculative, because during the campaign, this was his proposal. I don't think we've seen it from him in the Green Book. I could be wrong on that, Bob. I don't think we've seen it in his American Families Plan, but I think it's sort of worked into that 99.5 Act from the other Democrats. So, I mean, since I started my career 15 years ago, it always seems like the Democrats' number is 3.5 million. No, that's always been kind of where they think they'd be happy with estate tax. Obviously, Republicans have always been a little bit higher. So during the campaign, President Biden wanted to reduce it to 3.5 per person. It was still portable. So again, that was a good thing. We don't want that taken away. But then we're used to saying whatever our exemption is, I could use that exemption during my lifetime. So I could give away my 3.5 million. And that discussion sort of in the campaign was, well, only 1 million, you could only use 1 million for gifting tax purposes, for lifetime gifting. I don't like that, but it happens. The generation skip exemption would basically, again, tie to the estate tax, which it has for a while now. Generation skip is an interesting concept. Generation skip is the theory that I would create a trust for my children, and the trust would own the property. My children would get the income from it during their lifetime, and then at their passing, it goes to their children. So my great-grandchildren, or I'm sorry, my grandchildren. And what happens is, on some theory, I've managed to do a couple things. I've supported 2 generations. I've held what I want held together for 1 full generation, and maybe half of another if I say that my grandchildren can't have it till they're 60. I have kept my assets out of being taxed in my children's estate. So I may have reduced their estates if they're wealthy, or with 3.5 numbers, you don't have to be what is considered wealthy anymore. Anymore, I see generation skip right now has a lot more to do with control, because we have a generation who might not be very savvy with financial decision making, or we're trying to keep it together for, my son farms. I want him to continue to farm for his generation. So I'm going to put it in a trust, and the trustee will be directed to keep it invested. And, so it provides, generation skip provides a lot of benefit. The reduction of taxes in the next generation, the control aspect, keeping it together, holding it together. Generation skip has a lot of benefit. There's always sort of people get worried about, well, I'm going to have a trust for a really long time. Yeah, we can work through what that means, though, from a practicality standpoint. So generation skip tax exemption would be back to 3.5 million. If you try to skip more than 3.5 million, you're going to pay a 40% tax rate. It might be more under this plan, I guess. I think it goes up to 65%, which is just an insane number. So generation skip is always something you want to keep in mind.
I think the other piece of that is some liability protection, for a long time for those assets as well. So it's not only a tax mechanism.
Yep. And like from the control perspective, you're limiting the liability. If my son gets into a car wreck and they sue him, the assets in the generation skip are not his. So they can't go after the principal. If he's supposed to get the income, they can latch to the income. Also a divorce context that generally is people's biggest concern sometimes with their children. If he marries someone and then they get a divorce, will she get half the farm or whatever? And the answer to that is no, because it's in a generation skip. And so he doesn't own the farm. And so when she divorces, she can probably make some sort of crafty argument about income, increasing their life together. But in terms of the value of that farm or part of the farm, it isn't included in, it's not his asset, therefore it can't be part of a divorce. So like I said, the more planning we see is a lot more control based right now than estate tax based for generation skip.
And don't get hung up on a $3.5 million number. Maybe it's just grandpa's 80 acres that you'd like to see in there, and you're only skipping $200,000 worth.
Yep.
Even there,
a lot of times the generation skips we see tend to be skips of the real estate or the entity that owns the real estate. Your cash assets that are being sold, liquidated to cash. We're not really withholding that. If you want to frivolously spend what might end up being, your share is 200,000. Okay, do that. But we're not going to let you frivolously waste away the family farm.
I would just add, during my 37-year career, the estate exemption has never declined from year to year. It's been threatened to decline, but it hasn't. But we've also never started at such a high level that we're at today. So maybe I'm wavering on the historical context of that. But remember, in 2011, the threats were for the 5 million to go down to 3. And there were a lot of proposals, a lot of year-end haranguing to do things. And what it ended up being, it actually went up a little bit. So just be cautious as these things happen. Don't pull the trigger on something until we know what the rules are, because they can backfire to some degree. Alyssa, how about
once you've made a gift, you've made a gift, and that gift is gone, and the income from that gift is gone. It's a pretty serious thing. It's not something I encourage clients to do lightly.
That's right. Yeah, good point. Okay, here's some math. Look at the numbers here. This is going to be fun. Alyssa crafted this nice example. A husband and wife farm family, $9 million of land, a low basis of only $2 million. And we'll talk about the current law at the moment and we're doing just the basic piece. Forget about all the bells and whistles that your estate attorney can craft for you about gifting, partial interest, and other pieces. But just walk us through the current law and how this is a very common arrangement. The husband owns half, the wife owns half, and the husband's half is going to go to a trust first to protect his wife. Walk us through the details of how this works, Alyssa, from the legal
Sure.
side.
So we always assume, and this assumption is clear in my example, that husband and wife each own half. It's not always the case, but it's often the case, especially when we talk about, real estate, unless it was inherited ground. So they're each worth $4.5 million under my scenario. Most people at that value have an estate plan that basically says up to the estate tax exemption, I want you to put that much into a bypass trust, which is my wife gets all the income, but she's not in control. So it's not retaxed in her estate. If she remarries, gets into a car wreck, it's all protected. And then it says whatever I can't protect, then give to my spouse, because gifts to your spouse are a deduction. So basically what we call the AB trust, you've probably heard it called credit shelter trust. You have heard it called marital bypass trust. Those are basically designed to ensure at the first to die, there's no taxes paid, because we've basically said, do what you can within the tax laws and give the rest to the spouse, thereby resulting in zero taxes. So that's what happens when husband dies. And if you've ever heard me, you know that the husband always dies first in my scenario. And so a husband dies, $4.5 million estate. He has that marital bypass. So basically, our biggest concern is Illinois estate tax, because he's over the exemption, under the exemption, but he's over the Illinois, under federal, over Illinois. So into that bypass trust, we put what he can, the 4 million in Illinois. Now this is kind of done a different way because it's an Illinois Q-tip, but I'm trying to kind of make it as basic as I can for understanding. And then the other 500,000 goes to his spouse. So we have a federal estate tax or a bypass trust with 4 million that will ultimately go to his children after the wife passes. And then we gave her an additional 500,000. No Illinois tax, no federal tax, and a full step-up basis. So his share of the ground, if any of that is sold, now has a $4.5 million basis. Then wife dies, and she has her 4.5 million plus the 500,000 we gave her from his estate to avoid taxes. So we have a $5 million estate. Under federal tax right now, 11.7 is her exemption, plus the amount he didn't use of his 11.7. So clearly no federal estate tax, no concern, nothing there. Illinois law, we are $1 million over the exemption. And I'd like to tell you that it's just an easy way to calculate what that's going to be. And it's only easy because you input it into a calculator that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I do what I'm told. So I entered into the calculator. So on $1 million over the exemption in Illinois, the tax is $285,714. So you didn't pay, the family didn't pay any tax at the first to die, and they paid Illinois tax only at the second to die. That's current law with those scenarios. The tax basis, the low tax basis didn't matter, because at his death, he got a step up in basis, and at her death, she took a step up in basis. Normally, these are going to be different numbers because husband and wife their values aren't the same. But again, for purposes of following through on that. Bob, anything to add on that?
The values are different because we assume death might happen 5 or 10 years apart. And so the heirs end up with half of the land at this value and the other half at a different value. Yep. But still, they're stepped up at the moment in time.
It's a mixed basis, but it's still a stepped up, much closer to value, reducing taxes.
Yeah, the last time I was in Gene's office, we used the phrase bifurcated basis. I love that phrase. So that's your accounting term of the day. And I just noticed the tax of $285,000. That's 28% effective tax rate. And I mentioned earlier the table only goes to 16, but here the effective rate 28% because of that estate tax calculator. All right, take us to the new provisions.
So under the
like that.
Yeah, that's not a bad outcome. I mean, in reality, is under true planning with discounting, partial interest, etc., you will get that tax below 285. That's bare bones planning. I didn't plan the greatest, but I did okay. This is under the proposed law, and it makes some assumptions that our biggest concern is the transfer tax exemption, and it makes it so that we each get $1 million exemption, which again, those are all speculative, but it's what we know now. So we're back to same scenario, 9 million, each owning half. We have an AB trust. Under the proposed law, we still have no federal tax because of our adjusted for inflation number that we assume didn't change. Well, went up a little. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this assumes the 3.5 million, I think. Is that right, Bob? Yeah.
Well, yeah, but just 3 here essentially because we don't have a
3,
house
yeah.
included. So.
Yeah. So no, at the first to die, husband dies, no federal tax. We've got some portability carryover because portability is still there. We put the 500,000 to the wife, the rest to the bypass trust to protect, again, from estate taxes, creditors, second marriage, etc. What becomes important in this slide is that we have that $2 million basis. And now that becomes important because of that, 1 million of that is his if they each own half. So the new tax, the tax that occurs even when I don't sell anything, if husband has 4 million, keeping in mind he gave 500,000 to his spouse, he has $1 million in basis, so that gets us to 3 million. We think that they're going to grant us a transfer tax exemption of 1 million. So the 2 million is what's taxable under that transfer rate. Then we have under the infrastructure bill an increase in capital gain rate to the highest rate of 39.6. And of course, at 2 million gain, we're over the alleged million that they're going to tax this at. And we have the 3.8 net investment income tax, which a lot of people call the Obama tax. So you get to an effective tax rate of 43.4% on a transaction that never happened. That's what I have trouble wrapping my head around. It never happened. So we have 868,000 transfer tax due just because I died and I left it to someone else. And that's what happens when you take away step up in basis and you impact the new transfer tax. I don't know, and I think Christine touched on a little bit, I don't know if this will be a state tax. Like Illinois, for example, flows from federal. So presumably, yes, it will be. Iowa has its own rules. And so maybe it is, maybe it's not. I struggle to see either state not want to tax more if they can get the dollars. But so then wife dies. She owns her 4.5 million plus 500,000 from husband, no federal tax. We have that 285 in Illinois tax, same number as our prior. Plus, then we have this new transfer tax. She's at 5 million. She gets the $1 million basis subtracted. Then she gets her $1 million transfer tax exemption. So that mates to 300,000. I'm sorry, 3 million as the taxable event. There's that 39.6% high rate plus the 3.8, 1,302,000 transfer tax due, even with no sale. I can't emphasize that enough.
Well, and look at the total differences between the proposed and the current. I mean, it's a $2 million difference, pretty easy on a $9 million estate. That's pretty substantial. The other point I mentioned is, as you alluded to earlier, though, there's no estate tax currently in this plan until the second spouse dies, which might be tomorrow, but more likely 5 to 15 years from now. And in this proposal, much of the tax is paid at the death of the first spouse. So it's also a timing issue of how soon that liability is generated and the cash leaves the business. So it generates some liquidity problems as well, which we've begun to see. If this really happened and all they had was $9 million of land, but they need $2 million of cash to pay the tax, there's going to be a $2 million land sale by someone to create the liquidity to do that. And so liquidity is an issue that we've been talking to the folks in DC about. Is not only is the tax cumbersome, but it also essentially forces a land sale that might not otherwise be forced to it. Well, one of the pieces that can help, not necessarily this example, but our current examples is 2032A. We won't get into the details too much about all that other than to say, hey, there's lots of restrictions pre-death and post-death to qualify for this calculation. But we did want to share with you the math on how this actually works, because often we see the rules laid out of what you can and can't do. But let's get into the math of how it works. And this example is a land that has a market value of $10,000 an acre. We then go through the process of determining the net income per acre. So instead of a market value appraisal, we're doing an income approach appraisal. So take the $280 of income from neighboring rents, subtract the taxes on those similar properties of $30 I showed. That gives me a net income of $250 per acre. There's an IRS established interest rate every year that is required to use in your neighborhood to do this capitalization calculation. And so we take the $250 net income number, and currently that calculated interest rate is 4.74%. All that really serves is to take the 250, divide by that rate, and calculates a 5274 reduced value, special use value, 2032A value as farmland per acre instead of the $10,000 market value approach. The 2032A value is the income method approach. And so that reduces the value from 10 down to 5,200, lowers the value $4,726 an acre. And they cap how many acres can be used for this calculation. And in fact, it's more of a cap on how many dollars of estate value reduction one can gain. And currently that's 1.19 million. So in my example, 252 acres maximizes that reduction. And so in an overall estate plan, when we think about 2032A, I don't know if it's a big number or a small number, depending where you're residing, I suppose, but about 250 acres often is the limit that can be used to lower that value. But it's important for Illinois. For example, I have the $4 million exemption in Illinois, but if I can qualify under 2032A, I've essentially got a $5.19 million exemption to work with. But that's how it works. You would plug in your numbers for your neighborhood and determine how many acres will be used to create this maximum reduction. The Illinois estate tax is our next slide of how that works and how it works when we consider gifts. So in all cases here, all three scenarios, the farmer had a total of $8 million. And he made no gifts in the first situation. The tax was $680,000. But then we were worried about these federal exemptions, so we gave away $3 million and lowered my estate to $5 million. Illinois makes us add that $3 million back in, though, in this fancy calculator Alyssa has described a couple of times. But look what happens to the tax. It does go down to $352,000. And what if that person gave $6 million away in a rush December 27th strategy here to beat the clock on these new proposals that might become law? They gave $6 million away. Well, that still leaves them with $2 million. Illinois makes us calculate it as if we had 8, but the tax number does drop significantly to $92,000. So there are benefits to making larger gifts to reduce the Illinois estate tax. It doesn't wipe it to zero, but I just wanted to show 3 examples of the impact of dropping that to some degree. Alyssa added comments here.
I am not a math guy, girl, genius like you are. When I look at these and I run these numbers for clients, I always tell clients, I don't really know what Illinois is taxing when those gifts, but what it's clear to me is that you have to make a large gift to reduce that tax. A $1 million gift doesn't, I don't think, really reduces the tax. And then it seems to me as I run numbers, and again, all I'm doing is making up numbers and run them through the calculator to see what it's doing. It seems to start taxing less and less after the first $1 million. And so when I have clients who say, I'm gonna give 500,000 away, I say, there's no point. It won't save you any Illinois estate tax. They're gonna loop it back in and charge you tax on it. So, I mean, the reduction for Illinois comes from larger gifts.
That's right. And that's the point. You're exactly right. A $50,000, $500,000 gift doesn't change these numbers much. if you're really looking to utilize gifts to lower your Illinois state tax, it's going to require a large gift, and that might not fit any other good idea other than lowering this number, and this might not be the best answer to look forward. Well, we did have a question about residency, and I think this is an issue that's maybe still being maturing in the law, in the practice, and in the planning. But Illinois estate tax is against the property that is in Illinois. And there is a possibility to convert real property to personal property, and having an outside of Illinois residency might have some value. Alyssa, work us through this a bit. This is I'm not going to say a controversial, but it's not a strategy that's well cemented in case law. Is that fair to say?
No, it's not. I make, for a while now, I think you and I have kind of went back and forth on what we're thinking on this for years. And I think a lot of clients that I work with have entities. Those entities are drafted not necessarily because of this exact reason, but they're there for liability protection, transfer, succession planning, gifting, various reasons they use an entity, whether it's an operating entity, ownership entity. And so once I take my real estate and I put it into an entity, I don't own the land anymore. I own the entity which owns the land. It's like saying if I have GE stock, I don't own the GE plant. I just own an interest in GE in general. And so then all of a sudden that becomes, a stock certificate is nothing more than personal property. It goes with me where I go. And so if I move from Illinois to a different state, that's theoretically personal property. There's not a lot of case law that supports this. In Iowa, we have actually a statute that says this is what it becomes. It becomes personal property. I kind of trace it through legally because Illinois has land trusts. I'm sure you've all heard of those, and those are considered personal property. So I sort of take the position that those are, entity and land trusts are similar, and that would apply as well. But the theory being that then I move to a state that doesn't have a state tax, and all I own is personal property. And that happens to be in Illinois, or I own personal property, which follows me into the next state that doesn't have a state tax. And I have an entity that owns so they're still ground in Illinois, but they're not assessing any tax against me. Again, I will tell you in my practice, I have probably one client, they're not moving because of this, they move for a different reason, but we're taking the position this will how it will be. Still alive, so we haven't had to climb that hill yet and what that looks like. I have other clients though who, in all honesty, are considering what that might look like. They're close to the border anyway of Missouri, Iowa, whatever that would be, and considering taking that charge. Now, I sometimes struggle with, and I don't know, Bob, this could just be me thinking too much about it. If I leave all my equipment there and I farm there still, and I just drive home across the border, I mean, there's still some implications, I think, there to that. I mean, these work specifically maybe for clients who are retiring and they're not going to farm anymore, and they do own the entity. But there is a residency and establishing residency. There are a lot of hoops. I mean, you just don't decide today you're a resident of a different state. It doesn't work like that. Some states you have to have been here for so long. You have to be voting here. You have to be driver's license here. You have to show utility bills here. So, I mean, there is a lot of work and complex rules to establishing residency, but I will tell you that it's a conversation where we have more now than before about moving out of Illinois because of the estate tax.
Right, and the disparity between federal and Illinois. But this is a complex piece, just throwing it out there for further study. We're going to get in some of the strategies here, I think, now. And Alyssa, we're at 11:02, so we'll kind of glance through some of these because I know Christine or Mykel may have covered some of these already. But this is a few strategies to manage these family expectations. This is a very difficult process, a very involved process. You're dealing with large asset numbers, you're dealing with very significant family conditions. And so we listed a few things here that I think we've already maybe covered today, but the one I would maybe highlight under our current condition is keep your documents and your plan current, and always be thinking about what is changing. Did my values change? Do the rules change? And get comfortable with all these other pieces that can help you manage these expectations. The number one is hiring competent people like Alyssa to help make it happen. We listed a few other potential steps as we think about the remainder of 2021 and going forward in the gifting process. We saw the annual gifting exemption of $15,000 from any one person to any other person. Doesn't have to be a family member. So Debbie and I, my spouse, can give $30,000 as a couple to any other person. And if we include our kids and their spouses and the preacher and anybody we want, we can do that $30,000 limit. And so don't tell her I'm suggesting that as a strategy maybe at the moment. She wants me to keep boosting, oddly enough, my carryover basis, my DSUI, my unused threshold, because she thinks that's one more way to be increasingly attractive after my departure. Well, do we want to make larger gifts in 2021 to use up that exemption? We saw what had happens with Illinois. If the exemption is falling, that could be the right strategy. But I guess I'm saying maybe not yet, but think about what you would do if these things would happen so you're able to pull the trigger. Alyssa's already talked about gifting of probably not cash, but other entity and land, high basis property that might not get a new basis, might be something to give, especially if it throws off low income to you currently. I really like entity gifts. I really like land gifts via an entity. I don't like cash gifts as much. We don't know how long the parents are going to live, and I'm concerned about giving up that liquidity. And Liz has already mentioned gifts are final, impacts control the asset, and you've given it away. It's hard to get it back. Hard to get it back. Some more steps to consider on the next slide. If you want to add something about gifting, Alyssa, but
just
go ahead.
the gifting aspect, Bob. I think that what I'm telling clients is you need to get things together, because if you need to make a gift, you're probably gonna have a short window to do it. If we find that it's all going to come together and we need to make a gift, there are some clients now I have that are making gifts, but that's because they have an Illinois state tax problem no matter what, and it's a large problem, so we're gifting now. But most other clients that we're concerned about what might happen with that, especially the transfer tax, then they're going to be ready, and either we pull the trigger really close to the end of the year or we don't, but we'll be ready to do that.
Well, one other point I wanted to mention is the distinction between gifts of cash and property. They are different. So if I give someone cash, it's already been taxed, it's fully liquidity, there's no maintenance. And if I give another child exactly the same value in a hog barn, I got to pay real estate taxes, have to insure it, have to generate income, going to pay tax when I sell it. So there are different characteristics of different asset gifts. All right, some other steps to consider as we think about 2021 going forward, Alyssa.
One thing, just again, I think if your estate plan isn't specific addressing how you deal with the heir, you probably need to revisit that. But a lot of times, as we mentioned, we don't know if the transfer tax deferral will apply to, a sibling who owns, but you're the farmer and you farm it. But you probably want your client, you want your heir farming it anyway. So you want to make sure you have that leasing by a farming heir. One, because it's important in the succession plan, but two, it does, to the extent they make the rules similar to 2032A, which would make sense to me, then that could defer the tax. Irrevocable life insurance trusts, these are a blast from the past, I guess. That you create these to have a high, you create them to have an insurance policy that will basically play what used to be estate tax, now might be estate and transfer tax. You pay for it with your $15,000 annual. You make a gift to the kids, in essence. They use it to pay that premium through the trust. It's not includable in your estate, and it gives them some liquidity. That assumes that you can get a life insurance policy that will cover it, your health. A lot of things play into that. And then I think sometimes it's all about making sure that your current plan or your revised plan is flexible. You want to make sure that the trustee has, sometimes I have language that just says my trustee or his executor can make any tax elections necessary to reduce the overall tax if that's what's in the best interest of everybody. And that doesn't mean that they're going to make a 2032A, but it means they can make a 2032A. it's encouragement to the kids. Our goal is to reduce this tax, and we go along on that path. And so I think there potentially are going to be hopefully other deferral mechanisms that come as estate planners see what the rules are and have to, create loopholes. I mean, that's what we do, create the loopholes. And we want to be able to make those flexibility moves by the trustee or the executor or power of attorney, anyone who might be doing it who's not you.
We've talked a few times today already about balancing things, and this next slide describes some of those pieces as we think about always targeting reduced estate values. Well, there's always a trade to that. And so I just put a couple of things here that, we like to not pay the estate tax. I get that. We want to use discounting or special use to lower it, but we lose stepped up basis, we lose depreciation, we lose basis in our entities that reduce the things you see on the screen about less distributions, more tax on sale. Paying some amount of estate tax, I can't believe I'm suggesting that that's a good strategy, but it is the true piece of that. If we do pay the tax, we do get those things back. We get a higher basis, we get more depreciation, we get more tax basis in our entities. And so I guess I'm just saying here, think about the overall picture. Avoiding estate tax is probably a good idea because the rates are high, but it does come at a price. You give up some of these features we listed on the screen. And if for some reason you're left with paying $285,000 estate tax in Lissa's example, well, the silver lining is you'll get some things back on the other side.
It's always a interplay between, a lot of people we think about estate tax, but it's an income tax interplay as well. And what is somebody going to do with it? If you're just going to sell it, why maybe if this tax is lower, it's a matter of which tax is lower, and that's the amount I go with.
Well, Alyssa, we have our last slide and maybe just a minute to kind of summarize. So what to do now? We listed 3 pieces here, and you've already described the first one as calculate what the value of your estate is using the appropriate fair market value standards and include all the things that should be in there so you can identify what tax liabilities might exist and what things could be done to alleviate those if that's the best strategy going forward without giving up control, without all the other pieces. Also, what if the exemption is now 11.7, but what if it decreases? And we've said several times, we don't know the details. And the other thing I highlighted here is we also don't know the potential effective date when these things might happen. Do you have any updates about thinking about effective dates, Alyssa? Some suggestions, it was March of 2021, already past us, but yeah. I don't think that'll be the answer, but that was one suggestion.
I feel as good as I can about, at least from the gifting component, mostly because the green book was effective 1/1 of 22. Not that I was at least glad to see it wasn't the first date it ever got thrown out at a campaign rally. I mean, because that's sort of what you're feeling like, oh my gosh, we're going to tie this back. And if I make a gift now, I'm going to have that transfer tax anyway. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I tend to think that if it's going to happen this year, it's going to be effective 1/1 of 22, but that's just maybe me being hopeful.
Sure. Well, Emily is joining us. Emily's been watching the Q&A. Emily, what else can we help you with on Q&A? Any good ones there for us?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions here. Thank you guys for your presentation today. There's a lot of details and a lot of good information in that. One of the questions that we had come in was talking about IRA accounts. They say they have $2 million in an IRA account. Is there a way to pay the federal income tax out of the estate after death to get the taxes due out of my estate? Trying to lower my estate for Illinois death tax purposes.
From my perspective, if you have, well, obviously, if your primary is your spouse, then of course we've at least delayed that to the second to die, along with the 10-year or the inherit rollover IRA. I always tell clients, IRAs are tough because they're taxed. You don't avoid the tax on IRAs. One thing I always tell clients to do is if you have a charitable inclination, take your dollars for your charity, make them a beneficiary to some percentage, because they're not going to pay tax on it, and it gets your kids assets that get a step up. You know, it doesn't, if I was leaving $10,000 to a charity, you know, from my estate, now my kids get that 10,000 and the IRA pays charitable. I mean, there's Roth conversions. That's probably more Bob's specialty than mine. But IRAs are a tough one. And obviously the Secure Act that made it so that when you leave it, they have to take it over 10 years as opposed to their lifetime. That didn't help reduce taxes by any stretch of the imagination. Bob, thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, to the question, I'm not sure there's any good way to put a contingent tax liability in my estate calculation as a liability and lower the value of my estate. I think I'm stuck with a $2 million valuation in my estate calculation.
Perfect. I think we have time for maybe just one more question here. Does the family-owned and operated deferral create a permanent tax lien that will hamstring the next generation's ability to use the property as leverage for future growth?
Likely. 2032A is a similar practicality to it. They put a lien on whatever acres you designated as 2032A, and that's always going to show up. Some of this has to do with your banker. I mean, I've had clients with the 2032A lien get a lien on it. Now your banker has to be comfortable with being a second lien, and there's a lot of unknown about it. But I do believe, yes, it'll hamstring some growth in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for today. So we're going to go ahead and stop taking questions. Again, if you're a CCA, don't forget to claim your 1 CEU in professional development for this session. You can either scan the QR code on the screen or email our team with your CCA number to be submitted for credit. I would like to go ahead and thank Mykel, Bob, and Alyssa for their presentations this morning. And thank you all for attending the final day of the AMP Summer Seminar. Don't forget that you can find more information about all of the sessions and the AMP program at ilsoadvisor.com. Thank you for attending and have a great day.